Some prayers are too painful to say out loud, too honest for church pews, too raw for gentle ears. So we whisper into the fabric, into the quiet rhythm of the knitting needles, into the space between one stitch and the next. Welcome back to Grandma's Diary, where every thread holds a story, every pattern carries a prayer. Go ahead and subscribe. Click like if you've ever hidden your true prayers from the people who should understand them best. And tell me in the comments, have you ever encountered something that changed everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? Because what I found in my grandmother's closet 3 days after her funeral wasn't just a prayer shawl. It was a confession, a rebellion, a conversation with God that she never wanted anyone else to hear. But sometimes the prayers we hide are the ones that save us. And sometimes they also save the people we leave behind. My grandmother was the most faithful woman I ever knew. Every Sunday in the third pew from the front, every Wednesday at prayer meeting, every morning with his coffee and his battered leather Bible. She had a prayer for everything: sick neighbors, storm clouds, bread that didn't rise properly. His faith was as firm as the sunrise, as reliable as his Tuesday laundry routine. That's why what I found in her bedroom closet didn't make any sense. I was packing her clothes for donation, trying to make decisions about 70 years of careful accumulation. The church dresses she faithfully wore, the aprons that had served 10,000 meals, the sweaters she knitted for each grandchild's birthday. Deep inside, behind winter coats that still smelled of their lavender scent, my hand touched something soft, heavy, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age. I pulled it out, expecting another blanket, another quilt, waiting to be distributed among the family. Instead, I found a shawl, but it didn't look like any shawl my grandmother had ever worn to church. This one was different, almost wild. The colors were too bold for her careful taste. Deep purples and intense reds, colors that seemed to pulse with life, fury, and something resembling rebellion. The pattern was intricate, more complex than anything I'd ever seen her create, cables intertwined like vines. Stitches so small and precise, they looked like they'd been knitted by someone desperate to keep their hands busy. Someone who needed to dedicate themselves body and soul to something, anything, to avoid falling apart. In one corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look, were initials embroidered in a thread so dark it was almost black. E.M. 1987. Eleanor Morrison, my grandmother's name. 1987, the year my grandfather died. I sat on the floor of her room, holding that shawl, trying to understand what I was seeing. My grandmother did this during the worst year of her life, when grief nearly destroyed her, when she could barely get out of bed, much less attend the church meetings that structured her entire adult life. But why did she hide it? I spread the shawl over her bed. In the afternoon light, filtered through the lace curtains, the colors seemed even more intense, more vivid. It was then that I noticed the paper tucked into one of the folds. A single sheet, folded and yellowed with age. My grandmother's handwriting, but different somehow, more shaky, more urgent. For when Sunday prayers aren't enough, it said at the top. Below that, words that took my breath away. God, I'm so mad at you. You took him too soon. You broke your promise. You left me alone in a world that expects me to be grateful for 82 years when I needed 82 more. People at church keep saying it was your will, that you called Harold home because you needed him more than I did. But that's a lie, isn't it? You didn't need him. I did. I needed him to watch our great-grandchildren grow up. I needed him to help me figure out how to grow old together. I needed him to hold my hand when my time came. Instead, you left me here, feigning gratitude, pretending to find comfort in your mysterious ways. Well, I don't find comfort. I find anger. I find the rage so deep that I fear it will consume everything I have spent 70 years building. So I'm knitting. Each point is a prayer you will never hear in church. Every argument is something I can't say out loud. This shawl will hold my true prayers, my sincere prayers, my prayers that would shock the ladies of the congregation if they knew what I really think about their timing, about your plan, about the way you expect us to smile and nod and say, "Thy will be done," when your will breaks our hearts into pieces so small we can't find them all. I read that letter 3 times before the words sunk in. My grandmother, the woman who taught me to cross my arms and bow my head, who never missed a church service in 60 years. She was angry with God, furious, actually. So furious that she couldn't say her true prayers at the shrine where she had worshipped faithfully for decades. Instead, she had to knit them into a shawl she never wore, never showed to anyone. A shawl she had hidden from God Himself. I picked up the shawl again. I held it against my chest. And for the first time since his funeral 3 days before, I cried. Not the polite tears I shed at the funeral, not the tears of gratitude for a long and well-lived life that everyone expected, but the raw, honest tears of someone who had just discovered that the person they thought they knew best was carrying secrets that would have changed everything. Because I knew what it was like to have prayers that were too honest for church. Very dangerous questions for Sunday school. Anger too real for the gentle faith everyone expected me to inherit. I never imagined my grandmother would feel the same way, that she found her own way to pray when traditional prayers weren't enough. When Sunday morning faith couldn't bear the weight of a broken heart, an empty bed, and a future she hadn't planned for. I wrapped myself in that shawl. I sat in her rocking chair by the window, where she had spent the last few years watching the birds at the feeder. And I felt something I didn't expect. Comfort, not because the shawl was soft, although it was, but because he was honest, because every point was imbued with truth rather than pretense. With real prayer instead of proper prayer. With the kind of faith strong enough to be angry at God and still believe in Him. The kind of faith that doesn't have to be pretty, polite, or acceptable to anyone. The kind of faith that turns your prayers into something you can wrap around your shoulders when traditional comfort isn't enough. I couldn't stop thinking about that shawl, about the complexity of the pattern, the way the cabies twisted and turned like a physical manifestation of the pain itself. It wasn't something she had found in a magazine or copied from a friend. It was something she had created out of nothing, from the raw material of her own pain. The next morning, I called my Aunt Sarah, my grandmother's daughter-in-law, the one who taught me to knit when I was 8. "Did you know about the shawl?" I asked without explanation. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Then you found it. Did you know?" "I helped her pick out the yarn," Sarah said quietly. "I took her to the craft store 3 towns away, so no one from church would see us buying those colors." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because she made me promise never to tell anyone while she was alive. She said it was between her and God." "But she's gone now." "Yes," Sarah said. "She is. Maybe it's time." We met for coffee an hour later. Sarah brought a photo album I'd never seen before. Photos of my grandmother during those dark months after my grandfather's death. But not the serene woman I remembered from family gatherings. She was a different person. Deep-set eyes, thin, lost in a way that made her seem smaller than she was. She stopped going to church for 3 months, Sarah told me. First time in 60 years. I remember that. Everyone was worried. She said she couldn't sit in that sanctuary for another Sunday and pretend to be grateful for God's plan, when His plan left her wanting to die too. She said that? She said many things during those months, things that would have scandalized the prayer circle if they had heard them. Sarah flipped through the photos. She stopped at one that showed my grandmother sitting in the kitchen, knitting needles in her hands, yarn in colors I now recognized. She started wearing the shawl the week of the funeral, Sarah continued. She said she needed to do something with her hands, or she'd break everything. How long did it take her? 8 months. She worked on it every day, sometimes all day, like she was in a trance. And you never saw the final product? Oh, I saw it, Sarah said, once, when she was blocking the wall at the dinner table. What did you think? Sarah was silent for a long moment. I thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever done, she said finally, and the most moving. Because you could see the pain in it, because you could see the love in it. I didn't understand. Each stitch was a discussion with God about taking Harold, Sarah explained. But it was also a love letter to the man she had lost, to the marriage they shared, to the faith that was big enough to contain her anger. She wasn't knitting her doubts. She was knitting them into something beautiful, something that proved you can be mad at God and still believe in Him. Something that proves faith doesn't have to be pretty to be real. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She gave this to me the day she finished the shawl, she said. She asked me to give it to whoever found it after she left. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, but the handwriting was stronger than the angry letter I'd found the day before. More self-assured. For whoever finds my prayer shawl, it began. You're probably shocked, maybe disappointed, maybe worried about my faith, or my soul, or my relationship with the God I've served for 93 years. Don't be. This shawl saved my faith. It didn't destroy it. When Harold died, I thought God had betrayed me. I thought faith was supposed to protect you from the worst kinds of pain. I was wrong. Faith is not a shield against suffering. It is a vessel large enough to contain suffering and transformation at the same time. It's permission to be honest about how much it hurts to love someone and lose them. It's a space to feel anger, gratitude, sadness, and integrity all at the same time. This shawl holds 8 months of prayers I couldn't pray in church, the questions I couldn't ask in Sunday school, the anger I couldn't express in the sanctuary. But it also contains something more. It contains faith that has grown stronger because it has been tested, not in spite of being tested. Every point of anger became a prayer for understanding. Every furious cable became a call for strength. Every row I knitted through tears became a conversation with a God big enough to handle my honesty. The pattern came to me in pieces when I was too angry to sleep, too heartbroken to eat, too lost to know what to do with my hands. I would sit in Harold's chair and knit, and argue with God, and cry, and knit some more, until the shawl became a map of my journey from anger to acceptance, from feeling abandoned to feeling welcomed, from thinking that faith had failed me to understanding that faith was sustaining me all along. If you found this shawl, you probably found it during your own dark season. Put it around your shoulders. Feel the weight of another person's honest prayers. Know that you're not the first person to discover that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is tell God exactly how angry you are. And keep believing anyway. The shawl is yours now. Use it when faith on Sunday morning isn't enough, when you need to pray prayers that would shock the people who think they know you best. God is not afraid of your honesty. He is afraid of your pretense. Transform your true prayers into whatever you are creating. Trust that a faith big enough to sustain your doubt is a faith worth having. And remember, the most beautiful things often come from the most broken places. I looked at Sarah. She was crying. She never used it, I said. No, she said it wasn't for wearing. It was for engaging people who needed to know they weren't alone in their questions. People like you. I thought about it. The moment I found this shawl, a few days after I buried my grandmother, about the questions I carried, the anger I hid, the prayers I was afraid to say. How did she know? I asked. How did she know what? That I would need it, that I would be the only one to find it. Sarah smiled through her tears. Because she knew you, she said. She knew you were like her. Too honest for easy faith. Too real for simplistic answers. She knew that one day you would need permission to be angry at God and still believe in Him. She knew you would need to understand that the strongest faith is not the one that never questions. It is the faith that questions everything and continues to believe anyway. I wrapped my grandmother's secret shawl around my shoulders right there in the coffee shop, and I felt something I hadn't felt since her funeral. I felt understood, not by the people around us who were staring at the crazy woman wearing a knitted shawl in July, but for the woman who did it, who dedicated 8 months of sincere prayer to each stitch, who created a pattern from his pain and left it for me to find when I needed to know that faith doesn't demand perfection. It only requires truth. That night, I took the shawl home. I spread it out on the kitchen table as if I were studying ancient scripture. Because, in a way, I was. This shawl was my grandmother's theology, written in wool instead of words. His dissertation on the nature of God and suffering and what it means to keep faith when it feels like faith is holding you back. I traced the patterns with my finger, trying to decode the language she had invented. The cables that twisted and knotted and somehow found their way back to beauty. The fallen spots she deliberately left unfixed. The spots where the tension had shifted, where his hands were shaking or gripping the needles too tightly. It was all intentional. Every flaw, every imperfection. It wasn't just a shawl. It was a prayer map, a guide to navigating the territory between faith and fury, between believing in God and wanting to shake Him until He explains Himself. I found a notebook and started writing down what I could see in the pattern. The way it started, with simple stitches, basic knitting and purling. The kind of pattern you learn first, the kind that doesn't require much thought. But as it progressed, it became more complex and challenging. Cables that required counting and concentration. Stitches that needed to be worked in a specific order, or everything would fall apart. Like sadness itself, I realized. In the beginning, it's simple. You cry, you suffer, you can barely function. But as time passes, grief becomes more complex. You need to learn new skills, new ways of being in the world, new standards for living with a hole where someone used to be. About halfway through the shawl, something changed. Angry purples gave way to softer blues. Furious reds softened into warm pinks. The corporals stopped fighting among themselves and began to support each other. The pattern became less about struggle and more about flow. As if my grandmother had argued with God in the first half and listened to Him in the second half. As if she had knit her way from anger to something that wasn't quite acceptance, but wasn't quite despair either. Something in between, something more honest than either extreme. I wrapped the shawl around me and sat in my grandmother's rocking chair, the same chair where she had spent her final years, watching birds, reading the Bible, knitting blankets for great-grandchildren who would never remember sitting on her lap. And I tried to pray, not the careful prayers I learned as a child, not the prayers of gratitude everyone expected after a long and well-lived life, but the real prayers, the sincere ones, the prayers that had been growing in my chest since her funeral. "Oh my God," I whispered to the empty room. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to live in a world without your voice, without your wisdom, without your hands making everything better. I don't know how to continue her faith when mine seems so much smaller than hers. I don't know how to be grateful for 93 years when I needed 93 more." The words came more easily than I expected, as if the shawl was giving me permission to be honest, as if my grandmother were sitting beside me, nodding, understanding, saying what she had never been able to say out loud, that it's okay to be angry, that it's okay to question, that it's okay to engage in something soft and honest and say prayers that would shock the people who think they know you best. I don't know how long I sat there, praying, crying, and feeling sustained by something greater than I even understood. Sustained by the accumulated prayers of a woman who learned that faith does not require perfection. Just show up, day after day, point after point, even when you're angry, even when you're lost, even when you're not sure who you're praying to anymore. When I finally opened my eyes, it was dark outside, but I felt lighter, cleanser, like I'd been carrying something heavy and had finally been given permission to let it go. The shawl was still wrapped around my shoulders. It still held me like my grandmother's arms never could again. But something had changed. Now I understood why she had hidden it. Not because she was ashamed of her anger, but because she knew it was sacred. Too sacred to be casually observed. Too precious to be This shawl was her altar. Her sanctuary, her private sanctuary, where she could encounter God without pretending to be anything other than who she truly was. Broken, faithful, angry, grateful, human. And in that honesty, she found something that all her years of Sunday morning worship had never given her. She had found a God big enough to handle her truth, strong enough to contain your anger, loving enough to turn your questions into something beautiful. I took the shawl upstairs to my room. I folded it carefully and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, alongside my own prayers that were too honest for the church, along with my own questions that were too real for Sunday school. Beyond my own faith, I learned to be strong enough to doubt and believe at the same time. Tomorrow I would start knitting. Not exactly a shawl, but it was something to keep my own honest prayers. My own conversations with a God who wasn't afraid of my questions. My own pattern was born out of what I was struggling with. Because my grandmother taught me something more valuable than any recipe or technique. She taught me that the most beautiful things often come from the most broken places, and that sometimes the prayers we hide from everyone else are the ones that save us. 6 months later, I was sitting in my grandmother's old church, a same pew where she had worshipped faithfully for 60 years, where she had sung hymns, bowed her head, and said amen to prayers that only scratched the surface of what she truly believed. But today was different. Today I was wearing her shawl, not hidden under a coat or tucked away in a closet, but openly, with pride, like the sacred garment it always was. The pastor was preaching about faith, about trusting in God's plan even when we don't understand it, on finding peace in surrender. 6 months ago, I would have agreed. I would have tried to make my heart agree with my head. Now I sat there thinking about my grandmother, about the 8 months she spent weaving her rebellion into something beautiful, about how her faith grew stronger because she was honest about how much it hurt. After the service, Mrs. Henderson approached me. She was my grandmother's best friend at church. She served on every committee and organized every community dinner for 40 years. "Darling," she said, looking at the shawl curiously. "How beautiful. Did Eleanor make it?" "Yes," I said, "she did." "I don't remember seeing her wear that." "She didn't wear that to church." Mrs. Henderson looked confused. When did she do this? After Grandpa died. During those months when she stopped going to church. Mrs. Henderson's expression changed. She became more cautious. Ah, those were difficult times. Yes, I said. They were. But she came back, Mrs. Henderson said quickly. Her faith has been restored. I looked at this woman who had known my grandmother for decades, who had sat beside her at countless services, who had never seen the shawl that represented the deepest and most honest part of her spiritual life. Her faith was never lost, I said gently. It was too real for Sunday mornings. Mrs. Henderson didn't know what to say to that, but Pastor Williams did. He was listening to our conversation. He noticed the shawl and the way I wore it like armor. "Can I see?" he asked. I unwrapped the shawl from my shoulders and spread it over the back of the bench. He studied the pattern carefully. His hands traced the cables. The color shifted. The spots where the voltage had changed. "That's extraordinary," he said finally. "She did this during her season of darkness," I said. I remember those months. I tried to visit her several times. She said she wasn't ready for pastoral care. She was getting it, I said, just not from people. Pastor Williams looked at me with understanding in his eyes. Straight from God. God, honestly. He nodded slowly. The most powerful prayers often happen outside these walls, he said. In the spaces where we can afford to be completely real. Your grandmother knew that. I'd like her to feel safe being real here too. Pastor Williams was silent for a moment. Maybe, he said, we need to create more space for that kind of honesty. What do you mean? I mean, maybe we need to talk more about the prayers that don't fit in the bulletin. The faith that includes anger and questioning and the kind of love that argues with God. 3 weeks later, Pastor Williams started something new. A prayer group that met on Tuesday nights in the church basement instead of the sanctuary. With comfortable chairs instead of pews. With coffee and tissues instead of hymnals and offering plates. He called it Honest Prayer, and he invited me to take my grandmother's shawl. In the first week, only 5 people showed up. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband suffered from dementia. Mr. Johnson, whose daughter struggled with addiction. Sarah Miller, whose son had been killed in Afghanistan. People carrying prayers too raw for Sunday morning. Questions too real for the gentle faith everyone expected them to demonstrate. I brought the shawl. I told them about finding it. About the letter my grandmother had hidden in its folds. About the 8 months of honest conversation with God that saved his faith instead of destroying it. I have questions too, Mrs. Patterson whispered, about why God allows good men to forget their own names, about whether love means anything if the person you love doesn't remember you. I'm angry, Mr. Johnson said, for watching your daughter destroy herself and not being able to save her, for praying for miracles that don't happen. I'm angry, Sarah Miller said, about sending your son to fight for freedom and putting him back in a box, about God's plan, including bullets, roadside bombs, and mothers who never stop crying. We sat in that circle and passed my grandmother's shawl from person to person, engaging us in your honest prayers, finding comfort in knowing we weren't the first to discover that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is tell God exactly how angry you are, and keep believing anyway. The group grew, slowly at first, then more rapidly as word spread. People came carrying their own hidden prayers, their own secret conversations with a God they were no longer sure they trusted. Some brought knitting, some brought journals, some brought nothing but a willingness to be honest about how hard it was to have faith when faith felt like a job rather than a gift. And in that basement, surrounded by the kind of prayers that would never make it into the church bulletin, something beautiful happened. People started to heal, not because your circumstances have changed, but because they found a place where their questions were welcome, where their anger was understood, where their faith could be complex, messy, and human, where they could engage in the accumulated prayers of people who had walked this path before them. People like my grandmother, who knitted her way from anger to acceptance. Who discovered that faith does not require perfection. It only requires truth and the courage to keep showing up, even when you're not sure who you're showing up for. 2 years after finding my grandmother's prayer shawl, I started a prayer shawl ministry. Not the kind where church ladies knit pretty blankets for hospital patients, but the kind of thing where broken people turn their honest prayers into something they can wrap around their shoulders when traditional comfort isn't enough. The kind where you learn that the most beautiful patterns often emerge from the hardest questions. We meet every Thursday in my living room, around the same kitchen table where my grandmother would serve coffee to anyone who needed a place to sit and be heard. The women who come bring their own threads, their own patterns, their own prayers too sincere for a Sunday morning. Maria brings purple wool and asks about a God who lets children get cancer. Janet brings soft blue cotton and conversations with a husband who died too young. Rebecca brings angry red threads and arguments about justice and mercy and why good people suffer while cruel people prosper. And I bring my grandmother's mold, the one she created from pain and transformed into something beautiful. The one who taught me that faith is not about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to keep asking questions. Sometimes we knit in silence. Each woman works on her own piece. Each stitch carries a prayer that cannot be said aloud. Other times we talk about the patterns we're creating, about the prayers we're knitting, about how our faith has changed shape under pressure, about how we learn to love a God who doesn't always make sense, that does not always is sometimes seems absent when we need him most, but who is somehow present in the thread between our fingers, in the rhythm of the needles, in the way broken threads can be woven together to form something whole. Last week, Janet finished her shawl. She had been working on it for 8 months, the same amount of time my grandmother had spent on hers, the same amount of time it took her to go from anger to something that wasn't exactly acceptance, but wasn't despair either. She put him around her shoulders and cried, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, the tears of someone who finally found a way to carry what seemed impossible to bear. "It's over," she whispered. "How do you feel?" asked Maria. As if I could breathe again, like I've been having the wrong conversation with God for 2 years. What was the wrong conversation? I asked. I kept asking why. Why did David have to die? Why couldn't I have 1 more year, 1 more month, 1 more conversation? And now I ask him how. How do I carry this love with nowhere to put it? How do I live with a heart bigger than my life can contain? Those are better questions, Rebecca said. Because they have answers, Janet replied. The why questions may not, but the how questions do. How can I carry love without having anywhere to put it? I transform it into something beautiful. How can I live with a heart bigger than my life? I share this with people who understand me. How do I maintain faith when it seems impossible? I surround myself with the prayers of those who have walked this path before me. Janet lifted her shawl. The pattern was intricate, complex, unlike anything I'd ever seen, but somehow familiar too, as if she had tapped into the same source my grandmother had found, the same source of sincere prayer that transforms suffering into something sacred. "What are you going to call this?" asked Maria. Janet thought for a moment. "The like pattern," she said. because it contains all the questions that have answers, all the prayers that don't ask God to change what happened, but ask Him to change what happens next, to help us carry what we thought was impossible to bear, to turn our questions into something beautiful, to teach us to love a life that looks nothing like what we planned. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's shawl wrapped around my shoulders. I thought about the pattern she had created, the legacy she had left. Not just the physical shawl, but the permission it represented. The invitation to be honest about how difficult faith can be. The understanding that the most beautiful things often come from the most broken places. The knowledge that God is not afraid of our questions. He is afraid of our farce. I picked up my knitting needles and started a new project, not for me this time, but for the granddaughter I might have one day, for the woman she can become when life gives her more than she thinks she can carry, when traditional prayers aren't enough, when your faith on Sunday morning seems too small for the size of your questions. I chose colors that expressed strength rather than sadness, patterns that conveyed hope as well as pain. And as I worked, I thought about what I would write in the letter I would place between its folds. My dear granddaughter, I would write. This shawl contains more than just wool and prayers. It contains the accumulated wisdom of women who have learned that faith is not about perfection. It's a matter of persistence. It's about showing up day after day, point after point, even when you're not sure who you're showing up for. It's about being brave enough to be honest, real enough to question, human enough to doubt and believe at the same time. Your great-great-grandmother taught me that the most sacred prayers are often the ones we are afraid to say. Conversations with God that would shock people who think they know us best. But God is not shocked. He was expecting it, waiting for us to trust Him with our truth, hoping we bring you our true hearts instead of our Sunday morning hearts, hoping that we discover a faith big enough to sustain our doubts is a faith worth having. This pattern is yours now. Use it when you need it. Share it when you can. Remember that the most beautiful things often come from the most broken places, and that sometimes the prayers we hide are the ones that save us. I knitted until my fingers grew tired, until the pattern began to take shape, until I could see the future He would hold, the prayers He would carry, the comfort He would provide. For women who haven't been born yet, facing struggles I never imagined, but who would need the same thing my grandmother needed, the same thing I needed. Permission to be realistic about how hard it is to have faith when faith feels like a job and not a gift, and the certainty that they are not alone in their questions, that they are part of a long line of women who have made their way from despair to hope, from anger to acceptance, from broken to beautiful, one honest prayer at a time. It's been 3 years since I found my grandmother's secret shawl. The prayer she hid from God ended up being the prayer that brought me closer to Him. His honest anger became my permission to be realistic about my own struggles with faith. Her knitted rebellion became my roadmap for navigating the territory between belief and doubt. The shawl still hangs in my bedroom closet, ready for the next person who needs to be involved in someone else's heartfelt prayers. Ready for the next woman who discovers that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is tell God exactly how angry you are and keep believing anyway. Because the pattern she created out of pain didn't end with her. It continues in every woman who learns that faith does not demand perfection. It only requires truth. In every honest prayer woven into something beautiful. In every question transformed into comfort for the next generation. In every conversation with God, this is too real for church, but too sacred for anywhere else. My grandmother did not hide that shawl from God. She hid it from people who wouldn't understand that sometimes the most beautiful prayers are the ones that shock you. That sometimes the strongest faith is the one that questions everything and continues to believe anyway. Sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is to embrace someone else's honesty and discover that you are not alone in your struggles. The Prayer Shawl Ministry continues every Thursday, now in living rooms across the country. Women are gathering to transform their heartfelt prayers into something that can sustain them when nothing else will, creating patterns from pain, turning questions into comfort. Learning that the most beautiful things often emerge from the most broken places. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. What sincere prayer are you afraid to say out loud? What conversation with God would shock people who think they know your faith best? Click the like button if you believe faith is big enough to support our questions. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the sacred things we hide from the people who should understand us better. And in the next story, I'll tell you about the diary she kept under her mattress and the secret she wrote there every night for 47 years. A secret that changed everything I thought I knew about love, about marriage, about the price of keeping promises you make when you're too young to understand how much they'll cost. Until then, remember, your honest prayers are not too much for God. It's exactly what He was hoping to hear. The pattern of faith continues, in your hands now. Knit with the truth,